back to the new and hopefully improved metal kitchen. I know it's been a long time. I think, gosh, we're probably coming up on a year since the Swedish Meatballs video. Had a lot going on, which I said the last time. No car accidents this time, thankfully. I skipped that one, but had our football season. Team won the championship, which is nice. I have a bad knee to show for it, but what can you do? Alright, before we get started with the French Dip Au Jus, there's something I would like to talk about really quick. So today is August 6th. Tomorrow is actually my 34th birthday. It's going to be probably the 10th, 11th before you see this, but any of you that follow me on social media probably saw this past weekend was kind of hard for me. And I would just like to talk briefly about mental health. You've heard it before. It's okay if you're not okay. Please talk to somebody. If you need to talk to somebody, even if you're just having a bad day, you need to get something off your chest, you can come talk to me, honestly. Like, if you're watching this, you're probably friends with me on social media. Please feel free to message me, reach out to someone. If you think it's bad, if you're starting to feel, as much as we don't like to talk about this, if you're starting to feel suicidal, you have options out there. It's not the answer, and believe me, I've been there before. I've had some pretty scary things in my life, and Saturday was one of them. I started to get those feelings, and my friends helped me a lot. But if you're not comfortable talking to someone you know about it, there is a number you can call to Suicide Prevention Hotline. And that number, you'll actually see it down below on the video here. If you're not comfortable calling, or if you prefer to text, or whatever works for you, there's also a text line, 741-741. You can just text them hello, and they'll initiate a conversation with you. Please get help if you need it. You're not a burden on anyone. Trust me, that's the thing that gets to me. Somebody wants you here, I promise you. So talk to somebody, please. Okay? Now that we've gotten the heavy thing out of the way, see, the music isn't the only thing we keep heavy in the metal kitchen. Sometimes we gotta talk about some pretty serious topics, but now we're gonna move on to making our French Dip Au Jus. But before we go any further, we're gonna start out with a little bit of music. As you all know, I'm a pretty big Slipknot fan, and by the time you'll have seen this, they just released a brand new record called We Are Not Your Kind. Came out on the 9th, which would have been probably this previous Friday. This is Unsainted, the very first single off of it, and my favorite song in a long time. So sit back, listen, we'll be right back. Enjoy. That was Unsainted, the single from Slipknot's brand new album, We Are Not Your Kind. Now to start out here, we're going to talk a little bit about the cut of meat we're going to use. We're going to talk about the buns we're going to use, and then we're going to actually mix up our au jus, or with juice in French. Now to start with the meat here, it's a pretty standard chuck roast. You don't really need to get anything higher grade than this because when you have this cooking in the broth for so long, it's going to be so tender that anything more expensive, it's just not going to improve the quality of the dish. So just find yourself a good $4 a pound chuck roast at the store, and that's going to be just fine for that. Now, when I put this recipe together, I actually based it on using brioche. If you're unfamiliar with brioche, it's a type of bread that has a much higher egg and butter content. It gives it a really flaky isn't quite the right word. It's a really light, kind of airy texture. It's almost a little sweet even, and that sweetness is going to play well off of the kind of saltiness of this meat and the au jus whenever you have that. So you can go with a standard hoagie roll if you prefer. This is just what I recommend, and most grocery stores are going to carry this. So look for some brioche buns. I guarantee you will taste the difference for that. Now, when we're working on our juice, our broth, whatever you'd like to call it, it's 3 ingredients, and it's super easy to make here. You're gonna have beef stock, soy sauce, and bay leaves. You don't need to add any extra seasoning, so we're gonna go ahead and get this mixed up and get this working so we can get everything going along. To start here, we've got 3 cups of beef stock. You can use bouillon, you know, where you put the little cubes in water and boil it until it turns in, which is actually what this is. You can go to the store and buy actual beef stock. If you're feeling fancy, you can make your own beef stock. It takes a while. You know, it's probably going to taste the best, but whatever works for you. But we just go with bouillon because honestly the rest of the dish comes together really well with it. So this is 3 cups of beef bouillon we're going to start out with. We've got a 1/2 cup here of soy sauce. And 2 measly little bay leaves, just a 1 and a 2. Now it might not seem like much if you're not familiar with bay leaves, but these things are incredibly powerful. If you put more than these 2, maybe even 3, if you like the flavor of it, it's going to overwhelm your sauce. You will want to discard these after you're done with it. Don't eat these. They taste really bad. But we're gonna go ahead and throw those in there. Throw the lid on our crock pot here. And you're just gonna turn this on low. You don't need to have it any higher than that. Now to start with, we're gonna give this about 15 minutes to warm up. Gets everything mixed up, gets the bay leaves starting to infuse into the sauce. And then when we come back, we're going to go over scoring the meat, and then we're actually gonna rub some rosemary and minced garlic in that before we get that dropped in the crock pot here. So, gonna take a minute. This is the new single by September Mourning, Unholy. Check that out, and I'll see you back here in a couple minutes. Welcome back. That was Unholy by September Mourning. That is their newest single, and it is available now on all major digital retailers. They are very good friends of mine, actually, so please make sure you go check that out, support them, give them a follow on social media, so on and so forth. In this segment here, we're going to take a look at our roast. We're actually going to work on scoring it, and then we're going to rub in some rosemary and some minced garlic. And then the next segment after that, we're actually going to go over working on some caramelized onions and the white Italian cheese sauce. So if you will step over here, we'll get started working on the meat. So what we've got here is about a 3-pound chuck roast that I kind of talked about a little bit earlier. So we're going to just take a paring knife and we're going to do some light scoring in the surface of the meat before we rub our seasonings in. So to score, basically just take your knife, just really lightly kind of drag it across. You don't really need to put a whole lot of pressure because really you're just wanting to get some really shallow cuts in there just to get some of that seasoning kind of stuck down in there. And I kind of like to go a little bit each way here, so get a nice cross pattern. I pre-scored this actually, so I'm not going to flip it over and do the rest of it. I just wanted to demonstrate what you do. So basically just cut each way a little bit, and you can kind of see where these cuts have been made into it. Now that's going to help hold the seasoning in the meat while it is in the broth cooking. So what we've got here is about 2 teaspoons of rosemary, and then we've got about 2 teaspoons of minced garlic. Now my recipe actually calls for 1 teaspoon of each, but since this is a larger roast than I normally recommend, I went ahead and doubled that. Okay, so we're gonna start out on one side here, use about half of each. This garlic is really sticky, so just be prepared for that. If you've somehow never worked with garlic, you heathen. So we're going to go ahead and kind of just lightly rub that into the meat here. You don't want to get too crazy with it because it's going to stick pretty well as it is, and you don't want to bruise up your meat too much. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and flip this over here, and we'll just use the last of our seasonings. Get that in there. Like I said, you don't have to get too crazy with it. It'll stick in there pretty well. Now comes the fun part, the waiting. I'm gonna go ahead, pop off your lid and your crock pot. Can you smell that? It smells like victory. Actually, it just smells like soy sauce and beef stock, which is what it is. But we're gonna go ahead and get this giant roast in there. Be careful, it's gonna be pretty hot already. Now it's normal for your roast to not be completely submerged in your au jus. That's fine. We're actually going to flip this in a couple of hours during the cooking process here, so don't worry too much about that. And when we come back, we're going to work on making some caramelized onions, our white cheese sauce. But for now, how about checking out a little more new Slipknot? This is Critical Darling. We'll be right back. Again, that was Critical Darling by Slipknot off the newest album, We're Not Your Kind. Now, while we were at our little break, we went ahead and flipped the roast over in the crock pot, and now, as you can see, we're going to actually get started on our caramelized onions and our cheese sauce here. So again, if you could step on over here, we'll take a look at this. Alright, so first off here, we're going to take a look at our onions, which will be caramelized by the end. Now I went ahead and chopped these up because that part's boring, and if you really want to know how to chop an onion, let me know in the comments and we can go over that in another video later. But this is about a medium sweet Vidalia onion. If you can't find one of those in store, you can sub a yellow onion for it. It's a pretty mild flavor and it'll pair well with whatever you would want to put a sweet onion in normally anyway. And then right here we have got 2 tablespoons worth of unsalted butter. Now, when you're cooking, you actually want to use unsalted butter because regular butter, when they add salt to it, it can throw off the balance of your seasonings. So always look for this if you're actually using butter in a recipe. Okay. So we've got our pan a little heated up, so you can see our butter is already starting to melt. When we throw our onions in here, we're going to actually start this out on medium heat, and then as the butter melts, you want to keep stirring those onions so they incorporate really well. And then once you see the onions completely absorb the butter in the pan, you're actually going to turn your heat down to about a medium low, somewhere between a 2 and a 3, and you're actually going to let that sit for a long time. In a little bit here, we'll talk about the difference between just sauteing onions and caramelizing them. But for now, let's move on over to the cheese sauce. Now with our cheese sauce, we're going to just start with 2 ingredients and we'll actually add the other stuff later. So we're going to start with a pint of heavy cream and we're going to go ahead and add to our pan. Which you can see also preheated here. And then we're going to add in a tablespoon of butter as well. Now when you start this, you're going to start this just above medium heat, but it's very, very important when you're heating cream that you keep whisking it pretty consistently. When it's anything above medium, this will boil over and it will happen very quickly, so you do need to keep an eye on it while it's cooking here. But for the first about 3 or 4 minutes or so, we're going to just keep giving this a good steady whisk, kind of letting it start to reduce, letting this butter get melted in there. And then we'll move on and get the actual cheese and the other seasonings added a little bit later. Alright, we're going to take a quick look here. Now you can see the onions, you can sort of see that the butter is starting to absorb into them. You can't really see a whole lot around there. That's about the point where you're going to want to turn the heat down. We're going to want to turn that down to about a 2, so pretty low, just above simmer. What's going to happen over the next, say, 45-ish minutes or so is that butter is going to start pulling out the sugars from the onions. That's where your caramelization comes into place, because you get that kind of sugary, buttery mixture that'll end up on the outside of the onions. When you get to about the last 10 minutes of the process or so, you're actually going to hit it with about a tablespoon of balsamic vinegar. It's not necessary for any, we'll say, chemical need. It's just it's a good flavor that pairs well with caramelized onions. When it comes to the cream here, it's starting to set a little bit. You can see it's steaming a little bit. So, as I said, just make sure you keep giving that a good consistent whisk for 3 or 4 minutes or so. You'll start to see a soft boil on top of that. You'll see bubbles kind of coming up around the edges and then a little bit in the middle. That's about the point when you want to turn your heat on that down. down to about a 3 or 4 or something like that. Do keep an eye on it because there could still be some residual heat on your burner that could cause it to boil over, but we're going to end up giving that some time to reduce before we end up adding our cheese. Now the reason you might wonder why you don't want to add your cheese to your cream right now is cheese can't get too hot when it's cooking. There's a protein in there, and I think I actually might have talked about this in a past video. But there's a protein in the cheese that will separate if it gets too hot, and it'll make your sauce really sandy almost. So you'll want to cook and then reduce your cream, and then you'll give it some time to cool before you start adding your cheeses in later. But for now, we're going to take another quick break. This is Glass Animals by September Mourning. We'll come back and kind of deal with a little bit more of this and check on how the roast is doing. Again, welcome back. That was Glass Animals by September Mourning. Now, while the stuff back here is working, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the French Dip Au Jus. Despite the name French Dip, it was actually created in Los Angeles somewhere between 1908 and 1918. No one's 100% sure because there are 2 different restaurants that claim to be the origins of the sandwich, and there are actually a few different tales. One of the more popular ones says that the runner actually dropped the sandwich in a pan of meat drippings and then served it to, I want to say it was a firefighter or something to that effect, and he really liked it once it was born. Some say the chef just decided it would be good to dip it in there and served it like that. There are a handful of different stories about where it came from, but there are 2 different restaurants that claim it. Felipe the Original, and if you actually go Google them, you'll see their logo. They have kind of a roundish logo, and it says the home of the original French dip. And then there's Cole's Electric Buffet or something to that effect. It was kind of a silly name, but both of them claim that they founded the sandwich. There's not really enough evidence to prove which one is correct. Now, you probably noticed as well that the ending of it is Au Jus. That's literally just French for with juice. Now that's a pretty common French culinary term, but using it with French dip is actually a little bit of a misnomer. When you cook something au jus, or with au jus as they typically will say, you actually cook a meat in its own drippings. So imagine when you're cooking bacon and the grease starts to come out, and having the grease there kind of continues cooking the bacon. In a way that would be au jus. When you make a French dip, you typically add beef stock outside of what would come from your roast. So having that there means, you know, if you really want to get literal about it, it's not au jus, but that's what we call it. So, you know, take it or leave it. If you just want to call it a French dip, as I think most people do, no one's going to get mad at you about it. And if they do, if they say, well, it's actually a French dip au jus, be like, because that guy in that Metal Kitchen video told me what that meant, and I don't really remember it, but you're wrong. So you learned something today. Now when we go to serve the meat, we're actually going to pull that roast out, we're going to chomp it up, which I'll show you a little bit of. Traditionally, since we're on that today, French dips are actually served shaved, kind of like if you get a roast beef sandwich. I like chopping it up. I think it's easier to eat, it's easier to handle, the meat doesn't fall out quite as much. If you have it chopped up, it all kind of stays in the bun. You can do it whatever way you like, but the nice thing about the way we prepare it here in a crock pot is it makes the meat super tender. So by the time you pull it out, you're barely going to have to put your knife through it to get it to chop. But when you're prepping that, we're going to chop that up, and then we're actually going to put it back in the juice for about 10-15 minutes or so. Let it kind of soak up a little bit more of that au jus before we serve it. Now, if you'd like to step back here into the kitchen, we're going to go ahead and get the onions and the cheese sauce finished up. Just look at those onions. This is a pan of caramelized onions. You'll actually see they reduced quite a bit as they break down, but if you look close here, you can see there's a good bit of shininess on the outside. That's the sugar coming out of it mixing with butter. So we're gonna take and give it a hit of this balsamic vinegar here real quick. Just about, say about a tablespoon or so there. Give that a good mix. Ah, you can smell that too, right? It's good. And we're gonna let these actually sit and cook for a little bit longer with this vinegar so it all kind of absorbs in there. And have a nice flavor at the end when those are done. Now we're gonna move on to our sauce here. So with our sauce, if you can see, it's a little bit thicker now than it is when it comes out, which is what we want. It's been cooking on low for a little while now. We're gonna add some salt and pepper to it now. We've got a teaspoon of kosher salt and then 1/4 of a teaspoon of ground black pepper. We're gonna go ahead and sprinkle in, give it a good mix up here. Now I've talked about this in the past. When I say kosher salt in the recipe, make sure it's kosher salt. The crystals are actually cut a little bit different than your typical table salt. A teaspoon of kosher salt is not equal to a teaspoon of table salt. If you were to use table salt in this, it would be very, very salty. So we've got that nice and mixed in there. Now it's time to start adding the cheese. Here we have 1/4 cup of just your typical grated Parmesan cheese. I'm going to go ahead and add that. Now you can use this cheese sauce recipe for other types of cheese as well. The Parmesan's always going to stay the same, but the remainder of your cheese you can change if you want to use cheddar, if you want to use it for like a pretzel dip. One day I'll go over my soft pretzel recipe and actually use sharp cheddar instead of the Italian cheese we're about to use here. We're going to give that a minute to get mixed in. Now when you're adding the remainder of your cheese, you see we've got a cup of shredded cheese here. This is a mixture of Asiago, Romano, Parmesan, mozzarella. Now you don't want to add all of this at once, because if you do, it's going to clump up really bad in your sauce. You're going to want to add about 1/4 of the cup or so at a time here. And then give that a good whisk for about 2 minutes or so. And you'll feel it when you lift your whisk out, it'll stop doing this. Just do that until you add all of your cheese. Now we're going to get the rest of this cheese added here. We're going to take a quick break and come work on finishing this up. But for now, this is some more new Slipknot. This is called Not Long for This World. We'll be right back. So we're going to start with our brioche bun here, and then we're going to take and actually add a little bit of juice inside of the bun there. We're going to take and add our meat here, then we're going to add our onions here, nice dark pretty caramelized onions, and then we're going to put some cheese sauce over it here. And last and definitely not least, we're going to add some au jus to a ramekin on the side so you can dip your sandwich. We're gonna listen to September Mourning's Empire. Be right back. September Mourning's Empire. All 3 of those singles are currently available online. Go check them out. Like I said, they're good friends of mine. It would mean a lot to me, and I'm sure it would mean a lot to them as well. If for some reason you guys watch this, Emily, Patrick, Rich, and Kyle, I'm sorry. But anyhow, I present to you the French Dip Au Jus. Thanks for watching. Hey, thanks for watching this episode of Metal Kitchen. If you enjoyed it, give it a like, give the channel a subscribe. If you have any culinary questions or any recipe requests for future episodes, leave them in the comments below or hit me up on social media. You can also check out some of these other videos here on the side. Thanks for watching.